Hartman Talks. My name's Richard Angus, and today we are going to continue our discussion that we had previously with Christopher Robertson of Robertson IP about the world of intellectual property. And Christopher, I'd like to start off today with talking about how big this market is and what's driving its growth, because I gather that it's an extremely dynamic business. And I think our investors would be very interested to know what is actually going on. And has life changed since the beginning of COVID?
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Richard. It's great to be back. Intellectual property is exploding, I think, and it has been exploding for a number of years. I started out my career in the patent office itself, and I used to walk past the corridors where they used to keep the records, which of course then had to be transferred to warehouses, and now it's all online, and you'd need infinite warehouses to store all of the information, the IP rights that are now on file. There's millions and millions of documents where there used to be hundreds and thousands. So it is a rapidly expanding market, and I think that's because a lot of businesses now operate a model where it's innovation which drives their growth rather than simply production. And so a lot of where the growth of a business comes from is they're coming up with new ways of doing things, and that's intellectual property, or they're selling based on the strength of their reputation and their brand, and that's intellectual property. We've come a long way from the days when a patent lasted 14 years because it was the length of 2 apprenticeships. The world is a completely different place, and it's a much more global place, and that global nature of intellectual property has also been a great catalyst for the expansion of intellectual property. Treaties have been signed, and everything is becoming a lot more unified and regulated around the world.
So it's truly a global business, international business.
Absolutely. Intellectual property rights in themselves are jurisdictional, and therefore they relate to the individual country where the right is being exercised or being created. But because of all these treaties that have been signed, they have an international reach, and it's quite possible for even a relatively small company, say in the UK, to have a portfolio of intellectual property rights that reaches to all the major markets around the world.
So we have, I think, in this country, a lot of very clever people. They run knowledge-intensive businesses. They will be relying on patents to at least establish their business and then grow their business. In an international context, do they really have a chance against these foreign countries, or is the whole process pretty fair across the globe?
It's getting better. There are certain countries who have had a reputation in the past of not respecting and enforcing foreign intellectual property rights, and there are always going to be difficulties, cultural difficulties, language barriers, and that sort of thing when enforcing intellectual property rights abroad. But I think every country understands the need to be part of the global community, and they are adapting their legal frameworks accordingly. And there are law firms springing up around the world specializing. For example, in China, I spoke a while ago to a lady from a law firm in China specializing in the enforcement of international IP rights. The UK Intellectual Property Office, the Patent Office, actually has IP attaches in embassies around the world in key markets such as China, Brazil, and other parts of the world, and they're there to help as well.
Okay, so from an investor point of view, investors are looking at companies, they're looking at, have been used to looking at earnings growth, they've been looking at the hard assets, but now, of course, they're starting to look at the soft assets, including intellectual property. So how would an intelligent, informed investor start to look at the valuation of these IP rights that underlie the businesses with which they're investing?
The first thing that they really ought to do is to talk to a professional patent valuation analyst. The valuation, for example, of, or whatever intellectual property right we're talking about, the valuation of an intangible asset it's not a precise science, and there are different methodologies, and the appropriateness of each depends on the particular circumstances. But as a general rule, you look at the right itself, and we'll talk about patents because that's the most easy to talk about. There is the strength of the way it is constructed, the strength of the claims of the patent that you first of all assess. And then you look at the market for whatever it is that's being protected, the particular product that is being protected. And then you apply one of several methodologies in an attempt to value it. And you can either look at the value of creating the innovation from scratch, how much it would actually cost if you were to start from scratch and come up with this invention yourself, or you can look at the market and say, well, these other similar patents out there have earned this much money for their owners. So we could assume that this is going to be similar for this one. Or you can look at actual figures. How much has a patent or the invention protected by a patent earned for the business so far? What are the projections? And then, of course, you do risk assessments to see how certain are we of these market provisions, and all questions like that. The difficulty with the valuation of an intangible asset, and particularly an IP right like a patent or a registered trademark, is it's actually not worth anything in real terms until it's infringed, because the only thing that you can do to make money out of a patent rather than out of an invention is to sue somebody for infringement. So all of these other assessments are really about trying to work out how much it is potentially worth, and that's all you can go on with these intangible assets.
So presumably these intangible assets do trade. Companies buy companies, companies more presumably buy intangible assets. So can you just explain a little bit more about that market? And are you noticing any trends in the market?
Well, intellectual property rights are like any other asset. They have an owner, and the owner is the assigned person in the register of the particular IP registrar in that country. And they can change hands a number of ways, either by deliberate and direct assignment, which is done by contract, or by inheritance. So the successor in title of the original owner will become the owner of the patent. They can change hands by licensing. So it's more like renting rather than buying. And licensing can either be a voluntary arrangement between the owner and the person licensing it, or it can be an enforced. A government could force a company to offer a license, which is usually done in cases of dire emergency, or in cases where the patent is for a standard which the world needs to adapt, like certain online protocols and that sort of thing. So I think the trends tend to be that whole portfolios of patents are eaten up by the very large companies, not necessarily because they're interested in the individual technologies protected by those patents, but because they want to bulk out the size of their portfolio. For good or ill, they can then say to anybody else who wants to come in on the game, they can say, well, we've got 10,000 patents in this field, so you can have a read of those if you like, and then find out what you're still allowed to do. And that is enough often to squash any competition.
Well, Christopher, look, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for taking time to talk to us again. For those of you watching, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel, and we hope to see you next time. So thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.
Thank you, Richard.